I remember the call that morning because the mountains were unusually quiet. Early autumn had settled across the Rockies, laying down a thin veil of frost that clung to the pine needles and turned every exhale into smoke. I had just stepped out of the outpost with a cup of coffee when the radio crackled with a voice that carried something I rarely heard from him. Tremor. It was the archaeologist. He had been working alone all week near the old gorge, digging through soil that had not been disturbed in decades. He had sent me messages before about pottery fragments or remnants of ancient tools, but nothing urgent. Nothing that made his voice shake. "Sheriff," he said, "I need you at the dig site. Now." No explanation. No details. Just that tremor. I tossed the coffee aside and drove the trail out toward the gorge. The road wound through narrow forest paths, the trees leaning inward until their branches nearly touched above me. The sun had barely climbed the ridge, and the light filtered through in thin, cold beams that gave the wilderness a haunted stillness. By the time I reached the dig site, he was already pacing near the edge of the slope, breath fogging, hands buried in his jacket as if he needed to keep them from shaking. He looked up at me, eyes wide behind his glasses. "Sheriff," he whispered, "I think you need to see this yourself." He led me down a narrow path carved into the dirt where shovels, bags, brushes, and tarps were scattered in a small organized chaos. But my eyes were drawn to what lay exposed in the earth. Bones. Large bones. Enormous. They were half buried, emerging from the cold soil as if the mountain itself had tried to swallow them back. A curved rib that arched longer than my arm. A fragment of skull heavy and thick. A long bone that could only have belonged to something upright, but far taller than any human. I crouched beside the skeleton and brushed away a layer of frost with my glove. The texture of the bone was dense, rough, and disturbingly intact. Felt wrong. Felt recent. "What animal is this?" I asked. He swallowed hard. "I have measured every part twice. There is no known species that fits these proportions. Not bear. Not elk. Not anything in this region." I looked at him. He hesitated before saying the next words. "It matches folklore." I raised an eyebrow. "Folklore?" He nodded, adjusting his glasses with trembling fingers. "The skull ridge, the femur length, the structure of the ribcage. Sheriff, these look like Bigfoot bones." I stared at him in disbelief. People around these mountains love to tell stories, especially after a whiskey or two. I had heard it all. Shadows on peaks, strange footprints, echoes in ravines. But bones? Real bones? He knelt beside me and set his tape measure across the skull fragment again. "I know it sounds ridiculous, but these proportions match the descriptions from dozens of sightings. It is too big to be a man and too human to be anything else." The cold deepened around us. A wind brushed through the gorge, carrying the scent of wet stone and pine bark. I stood slowly, my breath curling past my coat collar. "Let's get the lab to test them," I said. "Carbon dating. If they're ancient, we'll know." His hands were still shaking. "That is what scares me." I helped him gather the samples. We wrapped pieces carefully, labeling them as best as we could without jumping to conclusions. I kept my gloves on the entire time. Even touching the bones through fabric felt strange, like they still held a kind of warmth. Presence. Once the samples were secure, I loaded them into my cruiser. The archaeologist stepped back from the open door and looked at the earth again. The rest of the skeleton still lay in the ground, as though waiting for us to return. "Sheriff," he whispered, "this was not supposed to be here." I closed the door gently. "Let's wait for the results. Maybe there is an explanation." He looked at me, but his eyes were distant, lost somewhere deeper in the gorge. "There is an explanation," he said. I am just afraid of what it is. I drove back to the outpost with the samples beside me, wrapped tightly but somehow still feeling alive. The forest outside the window shifted in the breeze, branches swaying like hands waving me deeper into a secret I did not want to learn. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the size of those bones, the way they curved unnaturally, the way they did not look weathered or ancient. They looked fresh, wrong. The laboratory called just after sunrise the next morning. The woman on the line did not bother with greetings. Her voice was tight, controlled, like she was trying to keep it from shaking. "Sheriff," she said, "we have the carbon dating results." I gripped the phone. And a long pause, a quiet breath, and then she said the words that changed everything. "The bones are only 12 years old." I drove back to the archaeologist's cabin before the sun had lifted fully over the ridge. The mountains were pale with morning frost, and the trees hung heavy with dew. When he opened the door, he was still rubbing sleep from his eyes, but he froze the second he saw my expression. "They dated them," I said quietly. He stepped aside and motioned me in without a word. His cabin was cluttered with books and maps, and the stove crackled with a weak flame. He sat down slowly, as though bracing himself for a blow. "Well," he whispered, 12 years. His breath left him in a single, startled exhale. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring blankly at the floorboards. For a moment he did not speak at all. Finally he said, "Then this was not a legend, not a symbol, not a story passed down through mountain towns." He lifted his head, voice cracking. "Sheriff, something living died here only 12 years ago." I nodded, though part of me still resisted the idea. Then the other part remembered the bones, the size, the shape, the strange warmth in the soil around them. "We need to go back," I said. "There could be more." He stood, grabbed his jacket, and we drove out toward the gorge again. The morning fog was stubborn, clinging to the ground like pale smoke. When we reached the trail, the world felt muted, as if the forest was holding its breath. We hiked in silence until we reached the dig site. The tarp we had stretched over the bones had collapsed slightly under early frost, but the soil beneath was undisturbed. "We should look beyond the ridge," the archaeologist said. "If one of these creatures lived here, it must have had shelter." We followed the slope upward. The ground grew rockier, the pines spaced farther apart. Wind whistled low through the branches, bringing with it a strange metallic scent that I could not place. Then we found it. A gap in the cliff face had widened since the last storm, revealing a narrow entrance half hidden by fallen rock. The archaeologist knelt and brushed the dirt aside. "A cave," he murmured. I crouched beside him. Jagged edges marked the frame of the opening, but the interior was dark and wide enough for a grown man to enter, or something larger. We squeezed inside. The air was cold and still. The cave opened into a chamber tall enough for a creature to stand upright. My flashlight swept across the stone walls, and what it revealed tightened something deep in my chest. Scratches. Deep, deliberate grooves etched high up, far above human reach. And lower, on a smooth slab of rock near the back of the cave, were marks that did not look like claws. They looked like strikes from a tool, primitive but controlled. Beside them lay scattered debris, cracked bones of deer, broken antlers, and what looked disturbingly like the remains of a makeshift bedding area. "This wasn't just a shelter," the archaeologist whispered. "It lived here, ate here, slept here." I moved deeper, sweeping the flashlight slowly. The beam passed over a small pile of sticks stacked in a triangular pattern. Not random, arranged, purposeful. "Sheriff," he said softly from behind me. "Look at the wall." I turned. and froze. Drawn in what looked like charcoal or burnt wood were shapes, rough and uneven, but unmistakably intentional. A mountain outline, a river path, a crude figure of something tall with long arms. It was a map. My throat tightened. It understood its territory, I said. It had awareness. The archaeologist nodded shakily. This is not an animal. Not in the usual sense. As we stepped back toward the entrance of the cave, something caught my eye near a corner of the chamber. A glint of metal. I knelt and brushed dirt away until a small casing sat uncovered. A bullet casing. I lifted it slowly, heart pounding. The metal was weathered, but not ancient. I pressed my thumb against the groove. This was fired, I said. Not long ago. The archaeologist stared at it. Someone knew it was here. The implications hung heavy between us. Someone hunted it. I tucked the casing into my pocket. We need to search the ridge, I said. But before we could move, a low creak drifted in from outside the cave. Not the wind, not falling rock. Something more deliberate. A footstep on hardened earth. We both froze. The archaeologist whispered, "Sheriff, the track's outside." We stepped toward the mouth of the cave, and my flashlight illuminated the ground where frost had begun to thaw. Footprints. Large. Deep. More human than animal, but far too big. The edges were fresh, as if the earth had been pressed only hours ago. But there was something else. A second set of tracks. Smaller. Human. They led toward the cave. And stopped. Right outside. I felt the hair rise on the back of my neck. The forest around the gorge was silent. Too silent. The archaeologist whispered, "Do you hear that?" I listened. It was faint. A deep, rhythmic sound carried by the wind, echoing off the stone walls of the gorge. Not a creature's cry. Not the howl of a wolf. More like breathing. Slow. Heavy. Pained. As if something was still alive out there. "We need to go," I said, gripping his arm and pulling him toward the trail. We hurried back, not speaking, not looking behind us. The gorge felt different now, watching us, listening. By the time we reached the outpost, the sun was slipping behind the peaks, and the cold was settling deeper into the valley. I placed the bullet casing on the desk and stared at it long after the archaeologist left. Something had died in that gorge 12 years ago, but something else had survived. Maybe only for a while, maybe still. I did not sleep that night, and when I closed my eyes, all I saw was the cave wall. The map, the marks, the footprints leading in but not out. And somewhere beyond the ridge, hidden in the growing dark, that slow, heavy breathing still echoed through the trees. I record this now with the mountains dark outside my window and the cold settled deep into the floorboards of this old cabin. It has been many years since that day at the gorge, but the memory has not thinned. If anything, it has grown heavier, like something alive pressing gently on my shoulder every time the snow returns to the ridge. I tell this story now because I no longer carry a badge, and I no longer owe the world the silence I once kept. The truth is quieter than people think. It does not shout. It settles. It waits. And sometimes it waits for the one person who was foolish enough to find it in the first place. After that second trip into the gorge, the archaeologist and I agreed never to speak openly of what we found. He was frightened of ridicule. I was frightened of something far older than that. Something I still cannot name completely. But even silence has its limits, and the mountains never let me forget. The week after we left the cave, a storm rolled in over the Rockies. The kind that turns the valley white and sends hunters running home before their tracks vanish. During the worst of it, I returned to the gorge alone. I do not know why. Maybe because the breathing we heard near the cave had followed me into my dreams. Maybe because I needed to know if the footprints were still there. Or maybe because some part of me feared that walking away meant letting the truth die again. The wind was sharp enough to sting my face as I crossed the ridge. Snow covered most of the ground, but the deeper I moved into the gorge, the more the world felt wrong. I stopped near the dig site when I noticed the tarp was gone. Not torn, gone. The soil beneath was exposed, cold, and untouched except for a single pattern in the dirt. A track. Deep, white, fresh. Something had come back. I stood there for a long time, watching my breath drift away from me. Then I turned toward the cliff face and saw it again. The cave entrance. The same narrow mouth of stone we had entered only days earlier. It was partially blocked now, as if someone or something had tried to hide it. A pile of fresh rocks lay beside the opening, the kind that had never seen weathering, the kind that had not been there before. I stepped closer and crouched. Snow clung to the edges of the stones, but beneath them the ground was disturbed. Something had come out, something large, and recently. I should have left. I knew it even then, but instead I brushed the snow aside and slipped inside the cave again. The air felt warmer this time, not comfortable, just less empty. I shined my flashlight across the walls, half expecting the scratches to have faded or the marks on the stone floor to be gone. But they remained, older now, somehow more fragile, as if touched by hands that no longer had strength. I moved deeper. The bedding of pine needles and worn ferns had been pushed aside. Bones once scattered in piles were now gathered into a small, organized ring. They were not placed for use. They were placed like a farewell. Then I saw the first new discovery. A single smaller bone. Not part of the creature's skeleton. Not shaped like something that belonged to folklore. It was human. A forearm snapped cleanly in the center. Someone else had been here, or something else had been dragged here. I knelt slowly and touched the fractured bone. The crack was smooth, too smooth, not the work of an animal's bite. Something strong and capable had broken it quickly. A memory of the archaeologist's shaking voice returned to me. This creature did not die naturally. I exhaled a long breath and forced my flashlight deeper into the shadows. That was when I heard it again. A thud. Soft. Heavy. Like a large hand settling gently on stone. I spun, light trembling in my grip. The sound did not echo. It came from just outside the cave. Not approaching. Not retreating. Simply waiting. I stood motionless as the cold crept down the back of my neck. Then, through the narrow opening, I heard another sound. Not breathing this time. A low, strained exhale that carried something like pain. I whispered, "Who is out there?" No one answered, but the exhale came again. Closer. More deliberate. Not a warning. Not a threat. More like grief. I took one step toward the mouth of the cave, and the sound faded instantly. The forest outside fell completely silent, as if swallowing whatever had stood there only seconds earlier. When I reached the entrance, the world was empty. No tracks, no shadows, only the slow drift of snow settling into the earth. I left the gorge with a weight in my chest I could not name. Months passed, then years. The archaeologist moved away from the mountains, though he never published a single detail from that dig. I stayed. I could not leave. Not with the memory of those bones sitting inside me like a truth I had no right to know. Over time, the townsfolk forgot. The dig site grew over with moss and frost. Tourists hiked past the ridge without noticing the slight depression in the earth where something impossible once slept. But some nights, when the storms roll in from the west and the air grows cold enough to numb bone, I hear footsteps in the gorge. Heavy ones. Slow ones. Not the eager stride of a living creature, but the weary walk of something old and alone. Something searching. I have found more bones since then. Never many. A rib here, a vertebra there, scattered through places no human ever visits. I bury them quietly, far from sight, because something about unearthing them feels like trespassing inside a grave too sacred for us to disturb. People still ask me why I retired. I tell them the mountains called me to rest. I tell them the winters grew too hard on my knees. I tell them the new deputies deserve their chance. What I never tell them is this. The first time I held those enormous bones in my hands, the world shifted under me. Legends are easier to live with when they stay legends. But when you find proof that something extraordinary walked these mountains only 12 years ago, everything you know becomes fragile. I keep the carbon date slip inside a drawer beside my bed. I read it sometimes on cold nights. 12 years. Not ancient. Not prehistoric. Just recent enough that somewhere, a few miles from where I sleep, a creature may have taken its last breath while humans walked the same trails. I end this confession with the truth I did not say aloud at the time. The bones we found near the gorge were not a beginning. They were the end of a story older than us. A story we failed to protect. A story that died quietly in the shadows and left only a few scattered traces behind. But the footsteps I sometimes hear in the gorge tell me this. Legends do not vanish in a single night. They fade. Slowly. And some part of them lingers, walking the mountain trails long after the rest of the world has stopped believing. That truth has never left me. And it began the moment I picked up those bones and felt, for the first time, the weight of a legend that died too quietly to be mourned.